Sarah's story begins against a backdrop of deep pain and despair. She was a young woman of rare beauty and goodness, the daughter of Rogel and Edna, and seemed destined for a life of happiness. However, his reality was marked by almost unimaginable suffering. Sarah had already been married 7 times, and on each of those occasions, something terrible happened. On the same night the marriage was consummated, her husband died. This tragic cycle was not the work of chance. There was an evil force involved, a demon named Asmodeus, who was determined to destroy Sarah's life and thwart any hope of love and happiness. Asmodeus, overcome with envy and hatred, took possession of each husband and took their lives before they could even share a future with Sarah. With each death, Sarah's heart broke even more. The situation was not just a personal torment, the tragedy brought shame and humiliation to his family. People in her community began to whisper, pointing to Sarah as someone cursed or guilty of something that attracted such misfortune. Judgmental looks followed her wherever she went, and her pain, already immense, was deepened by the feeling of isolation. Sarah cried in secret, questioning why all this was happening to her. What did I do to deserve this? She wondered. Yet, despite his suffering, something extraordinary shone in his heart, an unwavering faith in God. Sarah believed that, somehow, her life would not always be like this. She knew that only the Lord could intervene and deliver her from that situation. One night, overcome with despair, Sarah went up to her room, closed the door, and poured out her soul before God. His words were full of pain, but also of hope. O Lord of heaven, thou that seest all things, look upon me, thy handmaid. If it is your will that I live, deliver me from this affliction. But if not, receive my soul, for I can no longer bear this pain. Their sobs echoed through the house, but in their cry there was an acknowledgement of divine sovereignty. Sarah didn't know it, but at that moment, her tears were being collected and her prayers heard. Although she could not yet see, God had already begun to act, preparing a way for her deliverance and true love. But until this plan came to fruition, Sarah would continue to live the weight of her story, learning to depend on God in the midst of pain. Sarah's story is not just about suffering, it's a lesson in how even in the darkest of times, faith can sustain us. It is the beginning of a journey that will show how God can transform the deepest despair into joy and redemption. Sarah's faith in God, even in pain. Sarah was a young woman who knew pain like few people could imagine. He carried with him the weight of 7 marriages destroyed before they even began, the mark of a suffering that seemed unbearable. But through it all, something remarkable shone in her, an unshakable faith in God. Despite her sadness, shame, and humiliation, Sarah did not let despair keep her from the Lord. Each night, Sarah retired to a quiet place in her home where she could pour out her heart before God. There, in his solitude, his prayers were intense and full of emotion. O God of heaven, she cried, I know that everything that happens is under your control. You see my pain, my shame, and the judgment I suffer. If it be your will, deliver me from this suffering, for in you alone do I find hope. Her words were mixed with tears, but they also carried the certainty that God would not abandon her. Sarah's faith was not just a cry for help, it was a complete surrender to the divine will. Even without understanding the reason for her suffering, she continued to trust. She knew that the Lord was just and merciful and that somehow he had a purpose for her life, even though it was impossible to see him at that moment. With each prayer, Sarah felt an inexplicable peace, as if God himself was by her side, listening to every word. It wasn't a peace that removed her pain immediately, but a sense that she wasn't alone, that God was sustaining her broken heart. This gave her the strength to face another day, even under the judgmental looks and cruel words of those who did not understand her struggle. In addition to prayers, Sarah also sought to honor God in her daily actions. She helped her parents around the house, took care of the chores diligently, and showed kindness to those around her, even those who looked at her suspiciously. It was as if, in the midst of suffering, Sarah found ways to express her faith in simple gestures, showing that her trust in God was not just in words, but in attitudes. Although Sarah didn't know it, her prayers were moving the heavens. The God to whom she cried out had already begun a perfect plan for her life. He had seen her tears, felt her pain, and decided to act on her behalf. In due time, her faith would be rewarded in a way she could never have imagined. Sarah's faith, even in pain, is a powerful reminder that trusting God does not mean being free from suffering, but rather finding strength and hope even in the most difficult moments. It is this faith that sustained her and that would lead her to the miraculous outcome of her story. Tobias' introduction and his journey. Tobit was the only child of Tobit and Hannah, an Israelite family living in exile in Nineveh. His father, Tobit, was a righteous and God-fearing man, known for his kindness and acts of mercy, even in difficult times. He was the kind of man who put faith above all else, and this profoundly influenced the creation of Tobit. From an early age, the young man learned from his father's example to value justice and fidelity to the Lord. However, the family's life was not easy. Tobit, who had gone blind after an accident, faced physical limitations and financial difficulties. Despite his blindness, he remained a man of faith, but he knew he needed to find a solution for the well-being of his family. It was then that he remembered a sum of money he had left in the care of Gabael, a distant relative who lived in a town called Rages, in Media. The money could bring relief to the family and secure Tobias' future. Tobit called Tobias for a serious conversation, something rare, considering that the father always made a point of protecting his son from the weight of family concerns. He said, "My son, I need you to go on a long and important journey. Many years ago I left a sum of money with our relative Gabael, and now the time has come to get it back. This mission is dangerous, but I trust that God will go with you and protect you." Tobias listened attentively, his heart torn between a desire to help his father and a fear of the unknown. He knew that the journey would be long and full of risks. Rages was hundreds of miles away, and the path was fraught with dangers, barren deserts, robber-infested roads, and other uncertainties. Still, Tobias, a courageous and obedient young man, accepted the mission without hesitation. "I will, Father. I will do this for our family and for the honor of the Lord." Before leaving, Tobias sought his father's blessings. Tobit, with trembling hands, prayed a fervent prayer, "Lord of heaven, guide the steps of my son and send an angel to accompany him. May he return to us safely, bringing not only the money but also your peace and protection." Tobit's words were full of faith, and Tobit departed with a trusting heart. While Tobias was preparing the supplies for the trip, something extraordinary began to happen behind the scenes. God, who already knew every detail of this mission, sent the Archangel Raphael to accompany him. Raphael, disguised as an ordinary man, approached Tobit, offering himself as a guide. "I know the way to Rage well," he said. "If you allow me, I will travel with you and help you in your mission." Unaware that he was facing a heavenly envoy, Tobias gratefully accepted the help. And so began Tobias' journey, a journey that would be much more than just recovering money. It was the beginning of a God-guided adventure, full of challenges, miracles, and lessons that would change his life forever. Divine guidance through Raphael. Tobias' journey began with a clear mission, but full of uncertainty. He knew that the road to Rages would be long and dangerous, but he had no idea how much God had already prepared everything for him to be protected and guided. Before Tobias even left, the Lord, in his wisdom and care, sent the Archangel Raphael to accompany him. Raphael was a heavenly messenger, but for this special mission, he took the form of an ordinary man, someone Tobias would never suspect was a divine envoy. At the beginning of his journey, Tobias didn't know exactly where to go. He had general information about the path, but he did not know the dangers and traps he might encounter. It was then that, during his preparations, a man approached him. Raphael, with a humble appearance and calm words, said, "It seems that you are preparing for a long trip. May I help you? I know the road to Rages and its surroundings well. I've been on this journey before and I know the safe way." Tobias, seeing the unexpected offer, felt immediate relief. He thought, "Did God answer my father's prayer so quickly?" But he had no idea who was really by his side. Thanking him for his help, Tobias accepted Raphael as his guide, unaware that his presence was the divine answer he so desperately needed. As the two began to walk, Raphael's presence soon proved to be something special. Not only did he know every detail of the way, but he also knew the best way to avoid problems. When difficulties arose, such as a more dangerous stretch or signs of possible thieves on the road, Raphael suggested detours that kept both of them safe. His wisdom seemed limitless, and Tobias felt an unusual peace in his company. In addition to being a guide, Raphael also became an advisor to Tobias. As they walked, he shared words of wisdom, talking about the importance of faith, courage, and obedience to God. His words were so accurate that Tobias felt as if he were hearing the voice of the Lord himself. "Trust the way, Tobias," said Raphael. "Even when everything seems uncertain, remember that God is always with you, guiding your steps." But Raphael was not just there to guide Tobias physically. He had a much bigger role in the journey. God had sent him not only to ensure that Tobias reached Rages, but to prepare the young man for something far beyond what he expected. The mission to recover his father's money was only part of the plan. On the way, Tobias would face challenges that would test his faith, and Raphael would be by his side in each of them, ensuring that he not only accomplished the task but also grew as a person and as a servant of God. Raphael's presence turned Tobias' journey into something extraordinary. With his divine guidance disguised as simple human help, God has shown that even in the moments when we don't understand, He is always watching over us. Tobias didn't know it yet, but he was about to experience miracles that would change his life forever. The meeting between Tobias and Sarah. Tobit's long journey, guided by Raphael, finally led him to the city of Rages, where Raguel, a relative of his father Tobit, lived. The fatigue of the journey was evident, but Tobias felt a growing expectation in his heart, as if something great was about to happen. He didn't know that his life was about to change forever. Upon arriving at Raguel's house, Tobias was received with great hospitality. Raguel, upon learning that he was Tobit's son, was thrilled and gave a warm welcome. "My young man, you are the son of a righteous and God-fearing man," said Raguel. "It's an honor to welcome you to my home." Raguel's kindness reflected his family's tradition, but something else was in store for this meeting. It was then that Tobias saw Sarah for the first time. She entered the room to greet the visitor, and their eyes met. For Tobias, it was as if time stopped. Sarah was of delicate beauty, but there was something beyond appearance that touched him deeply. Perhaps it was the sadness in her eyes, a shadow of pain that contrasted with her kindness and politeness. Tobias felt his heart race in a way he had never experienced before. Sarah, in turn, was surprised by Tobias' presence. He was unlike anyone she had met, not just in appearance, but in his posture and the sparkle of his eyes. Although she was marked by tragedy and fear, something in Sarah's heart warmed up in that moment. It was as if a small flame of hope had been lit in the midst of the darkness she carried. While Raguel talked to Tobias about his journey and his father, Raphael, who was present as a simple traveling companion, watched everything in silence, but with a faint smile. He knew that this encounter was not the result of chance. It was part of God's plan, carefully orchestrated to unite two lives that needed each other in ways they didn't yet understand. During dinner, Tobias had the opportunity to talk more with Sarah. He heard of her hardships and tragedies, but not with the intention of judging her. Instead, he felt compassion and a deep admiration for her strength and faith. Tobias did not see Sarah as a cursed woman, as many in the city considered her, but as someone who had endured difficult trials and still maintained dignity and grace. Raphael, noticing the feelings that were beginning to arise, pulled Tobias aside after the meal. In a firm but gentle voice, he said, "Tobias, you feel something special for Sarah, don't you? Know that God put you both on the same path for a reason. Do not fear her past, for the Lord has already prepared a solution. Trust and be courageous." Raphael's words filled Tobias with courage and determination. He knew that what he felt for Sarah was more than admiration, it was love. And while there were still challenges ahead, he decided he was willing to face them, trusting that God would guide him. That meeting was not just a moment of love at first sight. It was the beginning of a story where faith, courage, and redemption would intertwine, showing that God can transform even the most difficult circumstances into something beautiful and eternal. The revelation of Sarah's curse. As Tobias sat with Raguel and his wife, Edna, the once welcoming mood began to change. There was a gravity in the air, a tension that Tobias felt but didn't immediately understand. After the meal, Raguel, with a serious and worried look, decided that it was time for Tobias to know the whole truth about Sarah. "Young man," began Raguel, his voice charged with emotion, "it is a joy to have you in our house, but there is something important you need to know. Sarah, my daughter, carries a great sadness. She was promised in marriage 7 times, but each of her husbands died on their wedding night." Raguel's words hung in the air like a weight, and Tobias felt his heart tighten. He looked at Edna, who was standing next to her husband, her eyes shining with tears. "Don't think Sarah is guilty," Edna said, her voice filled with pain. "She is a pure young woman full of faith, but an evil spirit, called Asmodeus, has taken the life of every man who marries her. It is something that deeply afflicts us as parents." Raguel and Edna's confession was a blow to Tobias. He didn't know what to say. The love that had begun to blossom for Sarah was now mixed with an understanding of the weight she carried. His mind was full of questions. Why did such a terrible thing happen to such a kind person? Why did God allow this? And what did this mean to him now, that he felt in his heart the desire to be by her side? Edna, seeing Tobias' uneasiness, tried to console him. "You see, Tobias, we love you deeply and have prayed incessantly that God will deliver you from this curse. But, so far, no solution has been found. We want to protect it and protect it too. You need to know the risk before you make any decisions." Raphael, who was standing next to Tobias, remained silent for a moment, but his eyes shone with wisdom and confidence. He knew that this was a pivotal moment in Tobit's mission. Lightly touching the young man's shoulder, he finally spoke, "Fear not, Tobias. What seems impossible to men is simple to God. The Lord has brought you here for a purpose, and he will not forsake you. Trust in his guidance and act in faith." Raphael's words ignited something in Tobias' heart. He realized that, despite the fear and uncertainty, he had a choice to make: flee or trust that God had placed him in that place for a greater purpose. Sarah's fate seemed intertwined with his own, and Tobias decided that he would not allow fear to keep him from fulfilling what he believed to be the divine will. Raguel and Edna, still cautious, watched Tobias intently. The young man, with a gleam of determination in his eye, replied firmly, "I do not fear, because I trust in the God of my father, Tobit, and I know that he is faithful. If it is his will, Sarah will be delivered from this torment, and together we will find a new beginning." Raguel and Edna were surprised by Tobias' courage, but at the same time they felt a spark of hope. Perhaps, finally, this was the moment when God would answer the prayers of so many years. Tobias' courage and trust in God. The revelation about the curse hanging over Sarah could have made any man retreat, but Tobias was no ordinary man. His heart, full of love and compassion, would not allow him to flee in the face of the challenge. He did not see Sarah as someone cursed, but as a woman of great worth, wounded by circumstances beyond his control. And more than that, Tobias trusted in God's power to turn even the darkest situations into blessings. After hearing the words of Raguel and Edna, Tobias withdrew to reflect and pray. In his heart, he knew that the decision he was about to make was not just about his own life, but about fully trusting in the Lord. He knelt down and in deep prayer cried out, "O God of my fathers, Lord Almighty, who delivered the people of Israel from so many adversities, I place my life in your hands. If it be your will, give me strength and protect me from evil. I trust that you are with me." While Tobias prayed, Raphael remained by his side. The archangel, who knew all that was to come, watched with a faint smile of approval. When Tobias stood up, full of determination, Raphael said, "Tobias, you chose well. The courage you show now is the fruit of your faith in the Most High God. Do not fear Asmodeus or any evil force, for the Lord has already prepared a way out. When the time comes, do as I instruct, and you will see the power of God at work." Tobias returned to the room where Raguel and Edna were waiting for him. He looked directly into Raguel's eyes and said firmly, "I wish to marry Sarah. I know the risks, but I trust in the Lord my God. He is stronger than any evil, and I believe he will protect us." Raguel was silent for a moment, surprised by the courage of this young man. He exchanged a glance with Edna, who was visibly moved. Finally, Raguel replied, "If that's your decision, Tobias, there's nothing I can do but respect you. May the God of our ancestors be with you and with Sarah." That same night, Raguel organized the wedding. While the preparations were being made, Tobias talked to Raphael privately. The Archangel, in his divine wisdom, gave her clear instructions. "When you enter the room with Sarah, take with you the liver and heart of the fish we caught on the way. Burn them in the brazier as an offering, and the smell will drive the demon away. Then pray with Sarah. Call on the name of the Lord together, and he will protect you." Tobias listened attentively, feeling renewed to know that he was not alone. He knew that his courage came from God, and that Raphael's presence was a sign of divine care. When it was time for the wedding, Tobias and Sarah exchanged vows in front of their family. Despite Edna and Raguel's fear, there was also a feeling of hope in the air, as if something new was about to happen. Tobias held Sarah's hands tenderly, looking into her eyes and promising that, with God's help, they would face any challenge together. Tobias's courage was not just an act of bravery, it was a statement of faith. He was willing to risk everything, fully trusting the Lord to guide and protect him. That night would mark the beginning of a miraculous transformation, not only for him and Sarah, but for all who witnessed God's power in action. The use of the fish liver to exorcise the demon. The long-awaited night has arrived. Tobias and Sarah's wedding was celebrated with joy and mixed emotions in Raguel's home. As the guests left, the young bride was led to the bridal room, where a quiet tension hung in the air. Everyone in the house knew the terrible story that accompanied Sarah, but Tobias was not willing to let fear rule that night. Before entering the room, Tobias remembered Raphael's instructions. He held tightly to the liver and heart of the fish they had caught during the journey, trusting that these seemingly simple elements would be used as instruments of God's power. Raphael, by his side, reinforced, "Tobias, don't hesitate. Burn your liver and heart in the brazier as soon as you enter the room. The smell will rise like smoke and cast out the demon that torments Sarah. And most of all, pray to the Lord, for it is He who fights for you." With renewed courage, Tobias entered the room and saw Sarah, his fiancée, sitting in silence. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope. Tobias approached with kindness and, before anything else, explained what he was going to do. "Sarah, I know the pain you faced, but today, with God's help, we will be freed from it. Trust me, trust the Lord." Tobias then prepared the brazier, following Raphael's words. He placed the liver and heart of the fish on the hot coals, and immediately a strong aroma filled the room. The smoke rose as a visible sign that something extraordinary was happening. At that moment, an evil presence was felt, an invisible shadow, the demon Asmodeus, who had so long terrorized Sarah. But Asmodeus could not resist. The smoke billowing from the brazier, accompanied by Tobias' fervent prayers, was a symbol of divine intervention. The demon screamed in fury, unable to remain in that place sanctified by faith. Under God's authority, he fled, being pursued by Raphael, who imprisoned him so that he would never torment Sarah or anyone else again. With the demon cast out, a deep peace filled the room. Tobit, feeling God's presence closer than ever, knelt beside Sarah. He took his hands and together they began to pray, "O God of our fathers, bless us and protect us. We praise you for your goodness and trust in your care. Make our marriage a reflection of your glory, and may our union be forever guided by you." The words of Tobit and Sarah ascended to heaven as an offering of faith, and the Lord responded with his blessing. At that moment, there was no more fear, only hope and joy. Sarah, who had so long lived under the shadow of a curse, felt at last free, and Tobias, with his courage and trust in God, had become the instrument of this deliverance. That night was not only the beginning of a marriage, but of a new life for both of them, marked by the power and faithfulness of God. The use of the fish liver was not just a symbolic act, it was the concrete manifestation of how the Lord uses even the simplest means to accomplish his wonders. Tobias and Sarah's wedding. The morning following Tobias and Sarah's engagement brought mixed emotions to everyone in Raguel's house. On the one hand, there was a certain fear, a shadow of doubt hanging over what could happen. On the other, a growing hope, fueled by Tobias' courage and the faith he demonstrated. Raguel, despite his fears, began to organize the ceremony. After all, marriage was not just a commitment between two people, but a time of celebration and trust in God. Sarah's mother, Edna, was busy preparing the bride. With tears in her eyes, she arranged her daughter's hair and adjusted her dress, while whispering silent prayers to the Lord. "My daughter, I can't help but feel afraid, but I see in Tobias something I've never seen in others. He has not only strength, but a faith that can move mountains. May God be with you today." Meanwhile, Tobias was in another room with Raphael, who, still disguised as a traveler, offered words of encouragement. "Tobit," he said, "remember that this marriage is not only between you and Sarah, but also with God. Your courage and faith have paved the way for this moment, and the Lord is with you. Today is not a day to fear, but to trust fully in the Most High." When the time came for the ceremony, Raguel's house was filled with a solemn atmosphere, but full of expectation. Family members and neighbors gathered to witness the union of Tobias and Sarah. Some looked on with concern, remembering Sarah's tragic previous marriages, but others were infected by the spirit of renewal that Tobias had brought. Raguel, as the bride's father, took his place of honor and called Tobias and Sarah forward. The ceremony began with a fervent prayer to the God of Israel, acknowledging his sovereignty and asking for his blessing on the couple. Raguel raised his hands and declared, "Lord, thou who art faithful to all thy promises, bless this union. May Tobias and Sarah find joy and protection in your presence." Tobit, holding Sarah's hands, looked into her eyes and promised, "Sarah, today I pledge myself to you before God. Whatever the challenge, we will face it together, always trusting in the Lord to guide and protect us." Sarah, moved, replied, "Tobias, you are the answer to my prayers. With you, I see hope where before there was only pain. I promise to be your companion, walking beside you in the light of God." The ceremony concluded with songs and praises to God, while Raguel prepared a banquet in honor of the new couple. During dinner, there was a mixture of relief and celebration. For all present, this wedding was more than a union, it was a living testimony to the power of faith and hope. That night, as Tobias and Sarah entered the bridal room, it was not only their courage that guided their steps, but the certainty that God was at the center of their story. The ceremony was not just an outward celebration, but the confirmation that, with God, even the most difficult moments can be transformed into joy and blessing. The wedding night protected by God. Tobias and Sarah's wedding night was shrouded in a mixture of expectation, reverence, and faith. After the ceremony, as the banquet guests began to leave, the young couple walked toward the room prepared for them. Each step was loaded with meaning, for Tobias and Sarah knew that this night would be different from any other in Sarah's life. There would be no room for fear, only trust in God. As soon as they entered the room, Tobias held Sarah's hands firmly and looked deeply into her eyes. There was a serenity in him that transmitted calm to the young woman, who carried with her the weight of so many tragedies. He gently guided her to a place where they could kneel together. "Sarah," said Tobias in a quiet voice, "first of all, let us seek the Lord. He is the center of our unity, our fortress, and the one who will guard us tonight." Sarah, her eyes shining with excitement, nodded. They knelt side by side, bowing their heads in deep devotion. Tobias began to pray, his firm voice echoing in the room, "O God of our fathers, you who created Adam and Eve and united them in love to inhabit paradise, bless us tonight. May our union be for your glory, and may you protect us from all evil. Lord, cast out every evil spirit from our presence and grant us peace." As Tobias prayed, Sarah added her own words, tears streaming down her face, "God of mercy, I surrender my life and my heart to you. Thank you for sending Tobias to me, a man of faith and courage. I know that the Lord is able to keep us." Amen. Confident that God was present, Tobias got up and went to the brazier in the room. Remembering Raphael's instructions, he removed the liver and heart of the fish that they had carefully guarded. Placing them on the coals, he watched as the smoke began to rise, spreading through the room with a strong, penetrating smell. Suddenly, a change in the environment was noticeable. It was as if something invisible was trying to resist, but it couldn't stay in front of the smoke and the fervent prayers of the couple. The demon Asmodeus, who had tormented Sarah for so long, was forced to flee. His evil presence was defeated by Tobit's obedience and the intervention of God, who used that simple gesture as a symbol of his protection and power. Raphael, the Archangel, was there, invisible to the eyes of the couple, but faithfully fulfilling his mission. He pursued and imprisoned the demon, ensuring that he could never torment Sarah or anyone else again. In the room, Tobias and Sarah felt a deep peace descend upon them. It was as if heaven itself had visited that place. There was no more fear, only gratitude and a growing love between the two. Tobit, holding Sarah's hands, smiled and said, "Today we are witnesses of God's power. He heard us and kept us." That night, Tobias and Sarah not only celebrated their wedding, but also the victory of faith over fear, hope over despair, and the love that is strengthened when God is at the center. It was the beginning of a new life, full of promises and the certainty that, with God, everything is possible. The victory over the demon Asmodeus. After that night of prayer and consecration, something great was about to happen. Sarah and Tobias, not knowing exactly what was happening in the heavenly planes, felt the peace that invaded the environment. But what they could not see with human eyes was the tireless work of the Archangel Raphael, who, with God-given authority, was fulfilling his mission perfectly. The demon Asmodeus, who had so long terrorized Sarah's life and cut down her husband's in a cruel manner, was about to be defeated once and for all. He, whose evil presence dominated Sarah's wedding nights, was now being forced to abandon his position of torment and curse. Raphael, invisible to the eyes of Tobias and Sarah, approached the area where evil still lurked. With a direct command and full of heavenly power, the Archangel commanded, "Asmodeus, spirit of destruction, you have no more dominion over this woman. The Lord has set you free, and now you will be banished from your lands and from your life." The moment Raphael uttered these words, a strong and hot wind swept through the room, as if nature itself was reacting to the celestial command. In the background, a deep sound, like a distant roar, echoed through the walls, and Asmodeus, the evil spirit, was compelled to leave. Like a shadow that dissolves in the light of day, the demon was dragged away, out of reach of Sarah and Tobit, to a place of total confinement. With a gesture of his hand, Raphael cast Asmodeus into the desolate and distant regions of Egypt, where his strength and malignity would be impotent. There, in eternal exile, he could no longer disturb anyone, least of all Sarah. His presence was completely eradicated by divine action, and the weight that had once hung over Sarah's life had now finally dissipated. Sarah, who had felt in her heart a weight of so many years of pain and suffering, now experienced indescribable freedom. She felt God's presence tangibly, as if he had embraced her in a loving and protective way. The evil that once haunted his steps, robbing him of hope, was now far away, banished forever. Tobias, next to her, also felt the difference. He noticed the transformation in the environment, the lighter air, the deep silence that invaded the place. He knew that this moment was something supernatural. His faith had won, and the Lord had kept his wife and his love. "Now we are free, Sarah," Tobias said, his eyes shining with relief and joy. "God gave us the victory. He is our refuge and our strength. Together, with him, we can face everything." Sarah, her face lit up with peace, looked at Tobias and replied, "I never imagined that I would come to this moment. Today, the Lord has shown us that his faithfulness is greater than any evil. May he be praised forever." The victory over the demon Asmodeus was not only a physical deliverance, but also a spiritual one. Sarah was now free from the curse that had haunted her for so long. Her marriage to Tobias was no longer a chance that seemed destined to fail, but a new beginning, where love and faith reigned. That night, as Tobias and Sarah entered the bridal room, it was not only their courage that guided their steps, but the certainty that God was at the center of their story. The ceremony was not just an outward celebration, but the confirmation that, with God, even the most difficult moments can be transformed into joy and blessing. The wedding night protected by God. Tobias and Sarah's wedding night was shrouded in a mixture of expectation, reverence, and faith. After the ceremony, as the banquet guests began to leave, the young couple walked toward the room prepared for them. Each step was loaded with meaning, for Tobias and Sarah knew that this night would be different from any other in Sarah's life. There would be no room for fear, only trust in God. As soon as they entered the room, Tobias held Sarah's hands firmly and looked deeply into her eyes. There was a serenity in him that transmitted calm to the young woman, who carried with her the weight of so many tragedies. He gently guided her to a place where they could kneel together. "Sarah," said Tobias in a quiet voice, "first of all, let us seek the Lord. He is the center of our unity, our fortress, and the one who will guard us tonight." Sarah, her eyes shining with excitement, nodded. They knelt side by side, bowing their heads in deep devotion. Tobias began to pray, his firm voice echoing in the room, "O God of our fathers, you who created Adam and Eve and united them in love to inhabit paradise, bless us tonight. May our union be for your glory, and may you protect us from all evil. Lord, cast out every evil spirit from our presence and grant us peace." As Tobias prayed, Sarah added her own words, tears streaming down her face, "God of mercy, I surrender my life and my heart to you. Thank you for sending Tobias to me, a man of faith and courage. I know that the Lord is able to keep us. Amen." Confident that God was present, Tobias got up and went to the brazier in the room. Remembering Raphael's instructions, he removed the liver and heart of the fish that they had carefully guarded. Placing them on the coals, he watched as the smoke began to rise, spreading through the room with a strong, penetrating smell. Suddenly, a change in the environment was noticeable. It was as if something invisible was trying to resist, but it couldn't stay in front of the smoke and the fervent prayers of the couple. The demon Asmodeus, who had tormented Sarah for so long, was forced to flee. His evil presence was defeated by Tobit's obedience and the intervention of God, who used that simple gesture as a symbol of his protection and power. Raphael, the Archangel, was there, invisible to the eyes of the couple, but faithfully fulfilling his mission. He pursued and imprisoned the demon, ensuring that he could never torment Sarah or anyone else again. In the room, Tobias and Sarah felt a deep peace descend upon them. It was as if heaven itself had visited that place. There was no more fear, only gratitude and a growing love between the two. Tobit, holding Sarah's hands, smiled and said, "Today we are witnesses of God's power. He heard us and kept us." That night, Tobias and Sarah not only celebrated their wedding, but also the victory of faith over fear, hope over despair, and the love that is strengthened when God is at the center. It was the beginning of a new life, full of promises and the certainty that, with God, everything is possible. The victory over the demon Asmodeus. After that night of prayer and consecration, something great was about to happen. Sarah and Tobias, not knowing exactly what was happening in the heavenly planes, felt the peace that invaded the environment. But what they could not see with human eyes was the tireless work of the Archangel Raphael, who, with God-given authority, was fulfilling his mission perfectly. The demon Asmodeus, who had so long terrorized Sarah's life and cut down her husband's in a cruel manner, was about to be defeated once and for all. He, whose evil presence dominated Sarah's wedding nights, was now being forced to abandon his position of torment and curse. Raphael, invisible to the eyes of Tobias and Sarah, approached the area where evil still lurked. With a direct command and full of heavenly power, the Archangel commanded, "Asmodeus, spirit of destruction, you have no more dominion over this woman. The Lord has set you free, and now you will be banished from your lands and from your life." The moment Raphael uttered these words, a strong and hot wind swept through the room, as if nature itself was reacting to the celestial command. In the background, a deep sound, like a distant roar, echoed through the walls, and Asmodeus, the evil spirit, was compelled to leave. Like a shadow that dissolves in the light of day, the demon was dragged away, out of reach of Sarah and Tobit, to a place of total confinement. With a gesture of his hand, Raphael cast Asmodeus into the desolate and distant regions of Egypt, where his strength and malignity would be impotent. There, in eternal exile, he could no longer disturb anyone, least of all Sarah. His presence was completely eradicated by divine action, and the weight that had once hung over Sarah's life had now finally dissipated. Sarah, who had felt in her heart a weight of so many years of pain and suffering, now experienced indescribable freedom. She felt God's presence tangibly, as if he had embraced her in a loving and protective way. The evil that once haunted his steps, robbing him of hope, was now far away, banished forever. Tobias, next to her, also felt the difference. He noticed the transformation in the environment, the lighter air, the deep silence that invaded the place. He knew that this moment was something supernatural. His faith had won, and the Lord had kept his wife and his love. "Now we are free, Sarah," Tobias said, his eyes shining with relief and joy. "God gave us the victory. He is our refuge and our strength. Together, with him, we can face everything." Sarah, her face lit up with peace, looked at Tobias and replied, "I never imagined that I would come to this moment. Today, the Lord has shown us that his faithfulness is greater than any evil. May he be praised forever." The victory over the demon Asmodeus was not only a physical deliverance, but also a spiritual one. Sarah was now free from the curse that had haunted her for so long. Her marriage to Tobias was no longer a chance that seemed destined to fail, but a new beginning, where love and faith reigned. And so, with God's victory over evil, the couple began a new journey together, with the certainty that, with faith, nothing could separate them, not even the darkest forces. The Lord had shown his power and led them to freedom. The joy of Raguel and Edna. After Tobias and Sarah's wedding night, deep relief spread through Raguel and Edna's home. These parents, who had followed their daughter's suffering over the years, were finally seeing hope come true. All the time Sarah had been tormented by the loss of her husbands, Raguel and Edna could not help but fear for their daughter's future. Each time a new suitor arrived, the anguish was renewed, because they knew that the evil that hovered over Sarah could once again drive away happiness. But now, something had changed. Hope was renewed before their eyes. Tobit, the brave young man sent by God, had managed not only to survive, but to win Sarah's trust and love. He had shown himself to be a man of unwavering faith, a lifelong companion. The marriage between the two had been consummated, and the evil that threatened them had finally been defeated. Raguel and Edna were inside their house, anxiously awaiting the return of Tobias and Sarah. The night before had been a storm of emotions. They prayed fervently, not knowing for sure what would happen, but always trusting that God would have mercy. When they heard Tobias' footsteps approaching, an immediate relief enveloped them. The fact that he was alive, with Sarah by his side, was a clear sign of divine intervention. When the door was opened, Raguel and Edna quickly approached, their faces filled with joy and tears of gratitude. Raguel, his hands trembling with emotion, was the first to speak, "Blessed be the Lord. He heard us. Tobias, you are here, safe and sound, and you have brought with you the greatest gift we could wish for our daughter." Edna, her eyes shining with happiness, hugged Sarah, who no longer looked like the same sad and tormented young woman as before. Sarah was radiant, full of peace and joy, and in her eyes shone the certainty that God had transformed her life. "My daughter," said Edna, in an emotional voice, "may God have been so merciful to us. Finally, happiness has come to you." Raguel, still unable to control his emotion, looked at Tobias with a smile of gratitude. "You are a man of courage, Tobias. Her faith was the key that brought our daughter back to life. May the Lord bless your unity, and may peace reign in your house." Tobias, with a sincere and humble look, replied, "I did only what God directed me to do. It is He who has guided us here, and He is the one who will continue to protect us. With Him, nothing is impossible." Sarah's parents could no longer contain their happiness. Raguel and Edna spent the night celebrating the victory of faith and hope over the darkness that had haunted their home for so long. They felt that at last their prayers had been answered in an extraordinary way. The atmosphere in the house was one of real celebration. The fear that had once taken hold of their hearts had now been replaced by indescribable joy. Raquel and Edna, as they watched Tobias and Sarah, felt a deep peace, knowing that their daughter was not only married, but completely freed from all evil. Tobit and Sarah's love was now a testimony to God's faithfulness, who would never abandon them. That night, the stars seemed to shine brighter in the sky. And so, Sarah's parents, who once feared the worst, celebrated with joy and hope the beginning of a new life for their daughter, with the confidence that, with God by her side, anything would be possible. The pain and suffering were behind him, and the promise of a blessed future was now being fulfilled before his eyes. Tobit's money recovery. After the great celebration of Tobias and Sarah's wedding, the young man, still by his new wife's side, was preparing to fulfill the mission that his father, Tobit, had given him. Despite the joy of Sarah's marriage and liberation, the initial reason for Tobias' journey had not been forgotten: to recover the money that his father had left with a distant relative in a distant city. Tobias knew that his mission was far from complete. Even with God's blessing on his journey, he knew there was more to be done. He said goodbye to Sarah and his in-laws, Raquel and Edna, who now saw him as part of the family, with great affection. They wished him good luck in his mission, certain that God was with him every step of the way. With the guidance and protection of the Archangel Raphael, disguised as a man, Tobias made his way to the city where the money was kept, a distant city full of challenges. The journey that had once seemed daunting to Tobias was now accompanied by a deep sense of trust. He knew that God himself was guiding his steps. When Tobias arrived in the city, he met his father's relative, a man named Gabael, who already knew of his coming and was eagerly awaiting him. Gabael received Tobias with great hospitality and explained that although the money was safe, there was an obstacle that would need to be overcome. Gabael had grown old and was almost blind, but he was still firm in his commitment to fulfill the promise made to Tobit. Tobias, with Raphael's help, managed to communicate with him, showing that he was there to recover what was his father's right. The process of recovering the money was not simple. It was a task that involved trust, patience, and faith. However, at every step, God's presence seemed to guide Tobit, and he, with patience and care, was able to ensure that everything was done correctly. The man who had the money handed it over with a smile of relief, aware that, with Tobias, the mission was being accomplished as planned. After recovering the money, Tobias felt relieved, but he also knew that his journey was not over. He now had something very valuable in his hands, but the greatest treasure was the confidence that his mission, both in recovering the money and in freeing Sarah from her curse, was about to be complete. Tobias, with a heart full of gratitude, made his way home with the feeling that he had fulfilled God's will. When he returned to Raquel's home, Tobias was received with great joy. Not only had the money been recovered, but he also brought with him the assurance that all the blessings that had been promised to him would be fulfilled. Now, with Sarah by his side, Tobias felt that all he had to do was trust God and be faithful to the Lord's purpose for his life. Tobias and Sarah were ready for a new chapter in their lives, no longer living in fear or insecurity, but with the confidence that with faith, courage, and divine help, all things were possible. Tobit's money was recovered, but the real wealth was in the peace that now reigned. In their lives, in the blessing of marriage, and in the testimony of God's power over all circumstances. Tobias's mission was finally complete, and the future opened before him and his wife with promises of a new beginning, full of hope and prosperity. The triumphant return of Tobias and Sarah. After successfully fulfilling their mission and recovering their father's money, Tobias and Sarah began their way back to Tobit's house. The sun shone on the horizon, illuminating the couple's journey, who walked side by side, more united than ever. The love they shared, forged in adversity and divine protection, was now the solid foundation for the future that was beginning to take shape for them. The return journey was not only a physical journey, but also a journey of faith. Tobias knew his mission was complete, but he also felt the enormous responsibility of returning home with the weight of promise fulfilled. By Sarah's side, he felt the peace that comes from trusting in God, and they were both aware that God had guided them every step of the way. As they walked, they talked about what life had in store for them from that moment on. Traversing familiar landscapes and now with a new sense of hope, they felt empowered by the protection they had experienced. They knew that they were not only returning to Tobit's house, but returning to a new life, a life transformed by divine intervention. As they approached Tobit's house, Tobias's heart beat faster. He knew that the wait had been long, but he also knew that the triumphant return was not only his, but also Sarah's, the woman he had freed from the curse, and who would now be his wife for life. Raguel's family, who had once received them with such joy, would now be united with Tobit and his house in an eternal way. Upon entering his father's house, Tobias was greeted with great celebration. Tobit, who had already been restored to his sight thanks to God's miracle, was radiant. He could hardly believe the eyes of his son, now back, with the money recovered and with Sarah by his side. Tobit's father, who had suffered so much during sickness and life's trials, now experienced the full joy of God's blessing on his family. Sarah, who had previously been marked by a destiny of suffering and fear, was now there, full in her new life with Tobias. She, who had faced so much sorrow and loss, now knew what it was like to be truly loved and protected. Her story, marked by despair, now had a new chapter, and she knew that this chapter was written by God. Tobit, moved, hugged the two and thanked God for hearing their prayers. He knew that his son had not only fulfilled an important mission, but he also brought with him a blessing that would transform the lives of everyone in the house. Family ties, the joy of reunion and the recognition of God's blessings filled the environment. The house of Tobit became a place of joy, gratitude, and praise to God. The return of Tobias and Sarah was not only the return of a mission accomplished, but the arrival of a new era for the family. From that moment on, the lives of everyone there would be marked by prosperity, unity, and the confidence that God was with them in every step they took. Everyone in Tobit's household felt renewed by divine mercy, and Tobias and Sarah's love was celebrated as a symbol of how God can transform even the most difficult situations into something beautiful and full of hope. The couple, now in their home, reflected on everything that had happened. And as the future opened before them, they could not help but recognize that in the midst of all the difficulties, there was something stronger that guided them, unshakable faith in God, who always keeps his promises and who, as he did with Tobit and Sarah, brings light where there is darkness, and joy where there is pain. Thus, with grateful hearts and renewed hopes, Tobias and Sarah lived in harmony, with their days blessed by God's presence and the certainty that, together, they could face any challenge that came their way. The triumphant return was not only the end of a journey, but the beginning of a new story, full of blessings and love. Tobit's healing by Tobias and Raphael. When Tobias and Sarah returned to Tobit's house, the joy of being reunited with the family was immense, but there was still a great mission to be accomplished. Tobias' heart was filled with gratitude for all that he had achieved, but his mind could not forget the need to heal his father's blindness. Tobit, though happy to see his son back, was still blind, and this cast a shadow of sorrow in his heart. Tobit, who now brought with him not only the money recovered but also God's blessing, remembered the counsel that the Archangel Raphael had given him. During their journey, Raphael had guided Tobias on how to cure Tobit's blindness by using the gall of the fish they had caught during the journey. This gall, the remedy that seemed so simple and natural, had the power to restore his father's sight and bring him the health he so desperately needed. With a heart full of faith and determination, Tobias prepared himself to accomplish what God had directed him. He knew that by following Raphael's instructions, he was fulfilling the divine will, and with that, his father's healing was not just a matter of hope, but of trust in God's power. The moment he got close to Tobit, Tobias explained what he had learned from the angel, and with the help of his wife Sarah, prepared the medicine. The gall of the fish was carefully applied to Tobit's eyes, while everyone in the house watched in silence, waiting expectantly for the result of this divine intervention. Tobit, who had spent so much time living in darkness, felt something different. A sense of warmth and relief washed over his eyes, and he soon realized that the darkness surrounding him was beginning to dissipate. His eyes, once blurred by blindness, began to open to the light again. Slowly, Tobit looked around, and the vision gradually returned, until he finally saw clearly as he used to see before his blindness. joy and amazement took over Tobit. He exclaimed in a shout of praise, "I see! I see!" And his words echoed through the house as a celebration of victory. His blindness, which had been a heavy burden in a long-lasting trial, was now completely healed, and he could see again the light of day, the faces of his family, and most importantly, the smile of his son Tobias. The Archangel Raphael, who was there as a guide and protector throughout the journey, now fulfilled his role as an instrument of healing. He had been God's messenger, and now the promise made to Tobit was fulfilled. The joy of seeing Tobit restored was immense, and everyone present in the house celebrated the wonder that had been accomplished before their eyes. What seemed like a simple miracle became, at every moment, a powerful reminder that when we follow divine guidance in faith, God's promises are fulfilled. Tobias, with a heart full of gratitude, looked at the Archangel Raphael and realized that without divine help, nothing would have been possible. He knew that his journey had not only been a mission to recover lost money, but a journey of transformation and healing, which had restored his father's health and strengthened the faith of the entire family. As Tobit regained his sight, he saw again not only with his eyes, but also with his heart. He saw the miracle God had performed in his life, and his faith was renewed. He, who had previously lost hope, could now behold, with his own eyes, the goodness and divine care. "God is good, and his mercy is infinite," said Tobit, in a voice full of gratitude. "He heard our prayers and answered us, as he always does." And so, Tobias and Sarah's journey, which had already been marked by challenges, overcoming, and miracles, now reached its climax with Tobit's healing. The family, now restored not only physically but spiritually, could look to the future with hope and confidence. God's goodness had been manifest in every step of his journey, and his protection had never failed. With Tobit healed, the family's home was filled with joy and praise to God. Tobias and Sarah not only celebrated the triumphant return from a mission accomplished, but also the miracle of healing that transformed their lives forever. God, in his infinite wisdom, had shown that when faith is firm and trust is full, he performs miracles, and light always conquers darkness. Conclusion. And so, with Tobit's healing, God's blessing was fulfilled in a wonderful and powerful way. Tobit's journey, which began with challenges and hardships, was now a story of faith, courage, and miracles. And most important of all, throughout this history, we have seen how unwavering faith can transform situations and bring healing, even when all seemed lost. Now, I want you to pay attention, because the great lesson of all of this is that just as Tobias trusted God and followed the directions of the Archangel Raphael, we too can trust God in our own journeys. Even when difficulties arise, we can be assured that with faith and perseverance, God's light will always guide us. The story of Tobit and Sarah reminds us that no matter how difficult things seem, God has a plan for each of us and is always with us, protecting and guiding us. So, stay tuned, because just as this story has shown us, we never know when God might surprise us with a miracle in our lives. The important thing is to never lose faith and always trust in his perfect timing. May this story of love, faith, and miracles continue to inspire you on your journey. And remember, just like Tobit and Sarah, you too can experience the transformation God has prepared for you.